Heyo guys, I'm Vel, and welcome back to the Easily Amused Weeb. Like last episode, I plan to do something a bit differently. Today I'm going to talk about the Junji Ito Collection, and since this is more of a discussion/opinion piece than a review this time around, I'll end up detailing my thoughts as we go along. And since I'll talk about a few specific works, there will be spoilers here and there. Keep in mind that this is likely an unpopular opinion, so take it how you will, but I stand by my opinion on this anime. The Junji Ito Collection came out during winter of 2018, and the anime was quickly panned by a lot of people. Everywhere I went within the community, I'd just constantly hear how bad it was and how it was this terrible adaptation of his works. But when I actually got around to watching it after the season had ended, I was very surprised to see that these people were really stretching the truth there. While the show itself isn't perfect, it's far from awful, and it's even a very faithful adaptation of his works overall. I was really happy that Ito even got a new anime series, but I never let my hopes get too high up for it, because I knew what to expect when it came to his works. Before I get to talking about the anime itself, I have to address that the collection has a couple of noticeably bad technical errors within it. While there's not too many of them, if you take notice of it, there's a good chance that it would take you out of the mood of wanting to watch the series, since a few of them can be pretty jarring. I didn't expect any of the monsters in the anime to look exactly like the source material, because they're incredibly detailed, and trying to animate that while remaining with that level of detail would be expecting way too much from Studio Dean. It's understandable that this lack in the art can drive people away, but I don't really see how everything else can, especially when this anime replicates the feeling of Junji Ito, albeit to a lesser extent in some of the stories. Now, while I do like this anime, I do note that there are a few problems with it that aren't technical. If it weren't for the glaringly obvious technical problems that even I could spot here and there, I probably would have rated this series much higher than what I do, which is around a 3E3 star. I feel the anime in general would have benefited much better if it were to put one story to an episode, or at least several shorter ones rather than two of disproportionate length. It's not very appealing to have an episode where 20 minutes of it is one short, and the last minute of it is a horrendously short story. I've watched some videos and read other people's reviews so I could try to understand some of the opinions that people have towards this show. While doing that, I've noticed that quite a bit of them think that Ito's works don't really translate well into the anime medium, and I don't really believe that. While some of the stories have indeed suffered from moving into the anime, there were quite a lot of them that I felt worked really well for it. I've also talked to my fair share of people about it, and they all, in one form or another, tell me that the anime doesn't understand Junji Ito, and I feel that's very wrong. When I get responses like these, it makes me feel that people hold Junji Ito to too high of a standard. While his art is outstanding because of the time and effort he puts into it, his writing tends to lean more towards subpar at times. While he does have some really well-written plot in his more famous stories, his lesser ones are just decent. They can be hilarious and campy at times, but they are usually bland since they, more or less, have the same plot structures, and even some rely too heavily upon his body and shock horror that derives from his ability to draw very grotesque things. Even some of the stories can be unintentionally funny because of how badly they're written. While people say that his building of anticipation through the page turn is the strongest suit with his works, I feel it's actually his biggest weakness. While it is effective at times in his mangas, I feel that it's used way too much. Don't get me wrong, it's really good when you first get into his works, but the more you read them, the more you just get desensitized and they won't have as much of an impact as the first time you read them. The art in this series is just alright. It's really good at times, but there are a lot of points where it's pretty hit or miss, and some of the background characters are noticeably bad. Most of the characters look more or less around the same as their manga counterpart, but there are some that have lost some of their original design in favor of something more simple. The biggest problem that people seem to have with this anime is how the more detailed monsters such as the neighbor or the ghosts from the bridge really lack in their art compared to the manga. But the lesser detailed monsters in the stories look pretty good. Of course, because of Junji Ito taking a lot of time in his work to detail things so heavily, the anime did have to make those cuts on his more artistically detailed creations. While it would have been amazing to see his more detailed things in full motion, It's just silly to expect the anime to be as detailed as the manga, since this would have taken years to create unless they had the budget to hire more people to get it done faster. When talking about the stories, you can separate them into 3 categories for this anime. The first one is the stories that translate really well into the medium, and a good example for that is the Long Dreams story. It's a straightforward one about a man named Tetsuro who checks himself into a hospital because he starts having dreams that are getting longer every time he falls asleep. While it may not be as visually impressive with the imagery as its manga counterpart is, it managed to replicate the Ito feel well enough. Its imagery was never something that I could even consider scary in the slightest within both of the mediums, but it doesn't fail to give you that unsettling feeling that you'd expect from one of his works. It managed to capture that somberness and the dread that the manga chapter had within it, and it even had that same sad and uneasy but peaceful ending. With this particular story, you could even argue that the anime did it better since you never even get to see what Tetsuro's dreams look like, and with that unknown factor, you could end up even more unsettled than what you would from reading it. In the manga, you find out that these nightmares are pretty unsatisfying and are just a weird hell of sorts that he goes through. While this is one of the weaker stories if you come to Ito for his horror, it's a very well written one that I've never been able to forget, and I feel that the anime did it more than enough justice. While this is just one example of some of the stories translating well into the medium, there are a couple others to take note of, such as Gentle Goodbye, Used Record, and Honored Ancestors, whose adaptations were really good and even had some improvements to the presentation of their story, as well as the overall feel of it being a lot better than their manga counterpart, more or less. On the other side of the spectrum, we get the second category for the anime. Though there wasn't too many stories that didn't adapt well, there were just a few that needed something more. A perfect example of one of these stories would be the Crossroads Pretty Boy, otherwise known as the first part of The Lovesick Dead. Art-wise, it looked pretty good, but it was incredibly simplified since Ito really outdid himself within the art of the manga. The story follows a boy who's recently moved back to a town that has a tradition of bothering strangers to get them to tell their fortune, which is usually about their love life. If the episode would have just been the story by itself, it would have been much better, but cutting off that last 5 minutes for Slug Girl really hurt some of the key details. It still gives off the feeling that Ito was portraying in the story, but the missing details can be a pretty big bummer. But, to the episode's credit, the manga version of the story was equally as confusing, since you never really learn anything about the pretty boy besides him being some sort of evil spirit causing people to kill themselves. Another part that could qualify for this category is The Town Without Roads, since a lot of the first part was cut off, making the story more confusing than it should be. It is really hard for me to decide if this belonged in this category or the next one. It did a lot of it perfectly to the chapter, and even the art was up to par since it wasn't the best visually, but the final nail in the coffin is just how the dialogue couldn't explain anything that was going on in the start, which just ended up rushing it more than it needed to be. The final category would be the stories that, while they were well adapted, their art just wasn't up to snuff or just something in general was missing that took away from the overall feeling of it. The perfect story to showcase this particular category is the one that I find everyone talking about because of its glaringly obvious technical failures, The Window Next Door. This particular story is very short and follows a guy who's just moved into a new house with his family, and finds out that there's a creepy old lady trying to get into his house every night. This is the one story in the entire collection that is constantly mentioned because its art is very subpar for the monster, and the monster in particular barely even moves when it's shown on screen. The story is still very well adapted into the anime, and the times that the woman does move can generally make you feel creeped out by how she moves. But this lack of movement is the biggest takeaway from it, which just makes it not as enjoyable to watch as it was to read. Other stories, such as Shiver, Let's Go to the Circus, and Blood Bubble Bushes go in this category as well, since they're all missing something, having somewhat decent animation while only really losing visual impact. In terms of other criticisms I have for the show, I feel that them putting in multiple stories based around Soichi was not the best choice, since there are so many more interesting stories and all of his stories don't really seem to matter, since there's not a proper payoff to the things that he does. While they are pretty good in their own ways, I feel it was a missed opportunity to put in something better. There are a total of 3 stories that involve Soichi, and one of these stories is used in the final episode to end the series, which is just unfortunate when even the story before it would have been a better impact on the end. It's nice to have a series start and end with the same kind of story on paper, but in its lack of a payoff, ending the series with one of Soichi's stories makes you feel cheated. In the end, I don't really think that this anime is anywhere near as bad as everyone says it is. Sure, there are some clearly awful parts within the series, and a small amount of the stories weren't well adapted, but this was still a good series. It wasn't mediocre, but it certainly was above average because it showed that it could do some of his stories justice. And, even if it wasn't the best at times, I'm sure that the series opened more people up to his manga collections, so in the end, it serves its purpose well. I had a lot of fun going through the various stories of Junji Ito again, rewatching and reading everything all over just to notice what was the same and what was different. It's truly fascinating to see how well a lot of the stories were adapted, and while there were a few that weren't the best of adaptations, they still piqued my interest enough to see how well they held up together side by side. You don't really lose out on much when compared to the source material, but a few of the stories really solidify the fact that this would have done a lot better if they chose a different format of presentation, rather than the split episodes. I hope you enjoyed hearing my thoughts on this matter, and I'd very much love to know how you felt about this. Don't be afraid to speak your mind with this too, because it's always amazing to pick someone else's brain on subjects like these. If you enjoyed this, I hope you'll stick around. See ya.
That doesn't make me feel any better. I mean, I haven't even graduated elementary school.